Chelsea called me absolutely pathetic in bed while her college friends laughed around our kitchen island, and I heard every single word through the patio door. I'd stepped outside to check on the grilled vegetables for her 30th birthday dinner, the same meal I'd been preparing since noon because I wanted everything perfect for her special day. Her voice carried clearly through the screen as she described in graphic detail how she fakes everything just to get it over with me, how she stares at the ceiling mentally planning her marketing presentations while I think we're sharing something intimate. I stood there paralyzed on our suburban Minneapolis patio, holding a spatula like some domestic fool, while my wife of 7 years performed her cruel comedy routine about our most private moments for the entertainment of women I'd welcomed into our home dozens of times. She told them how I arrange candles and rose petals on our anniversary like some desperate teenager who's never touched a woman before, how my attempts at romance are so pathetically earnest that she has to bite her lip to keep from laughing out loud. The worst part wasn't the brutal honesty of her words but how her friends responded with practiced familiarity, asking follow-up questions and sharing their own stories like this wasn't the first time they'd heard detailed accounts of Nathan the inadequate husband. I'm a marine biology researcher who spends his days studying complex underwater ecosystems, someone who colleagues respect for my analytical mind and published research on coral reef restoration, yet here I was discovering that the woman who promised to love and honor me views our marriage as prime entertainment material for her social circle. Through the glass door, I watched Chelsea gesture dramatically with her wine glass, describing how I whisper sweet things in her ear during intimate moments while she's thinking about anything else in the world, how my thoughtfulness feels more like obligation than desire, and how she sometimes fantasizes about being with literally anyone else just to feel something real. Her friend Sarah nearly choked on her Prosecco laughing when Chelsea demonstrated my expression during what she called my trying so hard to be sexy face, and I realized that every tender moment I'd cherished had been secretly catalogued as material for her comedy routine. They moved on to discussing my other shortcomings with the same casual cruelty, how my weekend woodworking projects in the garage are just another sign that I'm becoming my boring father, how I actually read instruction manuals instead of figuring things out like a real man, and how she sometimes wonders what her life would look like if she'd married someone with actual ambition instead of settling for steady income and predictable safety. I realized this public humiliation of our private life had been happening for years, probably since our honeymoon, while I believed we were building something meaningful and lasting together. The vegetables burned while I stood there processing that every supportive comment about my work, every proud smile at family gatherings, every affectionate gesture had been carefully orchestrated theater designed to keep me content and unsuspecting while she mocked everything about me to anyone who would listen. When Chelsea finally called through the door asking if dinner was ready, I walked back inside with the same accommodating smile I'd worn for 7 years, but something fundamental and irreversible had shifted in my understanding of who we really were to each other and what our marriage actually meant. Throughout the following week, I discovered that Chelsea's condescension extended far beyond our bedroom as she systematically mocked every aspect of my existence to anyone who would listen. I started paying attention to her phone conversations with a researcher's focus, noting how she described my recent promotion to senior marine biologist as totally meaningless since I just study fish all day instead of doing something important like her marketing work. She told her sister that my weekend woodworking projects were embarrassing attempts to feel masculine, laughing about how I spent 3 months building a dining table that we could have bought at Pottery Barn for half the cost and twice the style. During her video calls with college friends, she portrayed me as a controlling bore who prevents her from living authentically, claiming that I guilt her into staying home for quiet dinners instead of experiencing the vibrant social life she deserves at 30. I realized that every supportive comment about my research, every proud smile when I explained my coral restoration work at dinner parties, every affectionate gesture had been carefully orchestrated theater while she privately viewed me as deadweight dragging down her potential. The most devastating discovery came when I overheard her talking to her mother about our marriage, describing how she feels trapped with someone who has no ambition beyond his steady government job and his boring hobbies, how she sometimes looks around at her friends' dynamic husbands and wonders where her life went wrong. She complained that I actually read books for pleasure instead of watching sports, that I prefer cooking together on weekends to going out to trendy restaurants, and that I think planning romantic getaways to national parks counts as exciting travel. During a grocery store encounter that I witnessed from the produce section, I watched her animated conversation with the young cashier about his aspirations to become a DJ, noting how her entire personality transformed when she wasn't focused on my inadequacies. She became vibrant and engaging, laughing genuinely at his jokes and asking thoughtful questions about his music, displaying the charm and interest that had initially attracted me 7 years ago but had gradually disappeared from our interactions. I realized she was capable of being the woman I fell in love with, just not with me anymore, and that revelation cut deeper than all her cruel words combined. The cashier responded to her attention with obvious interest, and I found myself studying their dynamic with scientific objectivity, noting how she leaned in when he spoke, how her eyes lit up with genuine curiosity, and how effortlessly she made him feel important and heard. This was the same woman who rolled her eyes when I tried to share exciting developments in my research, who changed the subject when I mentioned work accomplishments, and who had trained me to keep my thoughts and observations to myself because they apparently bored her beyond comprehension. By the end of that week, I understood that Chelsea didn't just disrespect our intimate life, she fundamentally disrespected me as a person, and no amount of trying harder or loving better was going to change her core perception of who I was and what I was worth. Rather than confronting Chelsea immediately, I decided to methodically document her behavior while planning my response, understanding that respect cannot be restored through pleading or negotiation. I approached this crisis like any research project, keeping detailed notes about patterns of disrespect, cataloging her mockery with the same precision I used to study marine ecosystems. I began working out more intensely at the University Fitness Center, trading my accommodating schedule for early morning sessions that forced Chelsea to handle her own breakfast routine instead of expecting me to serve her coffee in bed like some devoted butler. I updated my wardrobe with help from my younger colleague Marcus, who seemed genuinely surprised that I'd been hiding a decent physique under loose-fitting polos and khakis, replacing my safe academic look with clothes that actually fit properly and made me appear confident rather than apologetic. I reconnected with old friends from graduate school who I'd neglected during my years of trying to be the perfect husband, accepting invitations to social events that Chelsea would have previously dismissed as boring academic gatherings full of people beneath her social standards. I realized that I'd spent 7 years trying to earn appreciation that should have been freely given, constantly modifying my behavior to avoid her criticism instead of expecting basic respect as my right. My transformation wasn't about winning Chelsea back or proving anything to her, but about reclaiming the person I'd been before marriage taught me to apologize for existing. I started staying late at the lab not because I was avoiding home, but because I genuinely enjoyed my work when I wasn't rushing back to accommodate someone who viewed my passion as embarrassing nerdiness. I bought a new truck without consulting Chelsea, choosing something practical for my research trips rather than the sensible sedan she'd insisted we needed for her image, and I felt genuinely excited about a purchase for the first time in years. I began accepting speaking engagements at marine biology conferences, rebuilding professional relationships that had withered while I focused all my energy on maintaining domestic peace with someone who saw my achievements as irrelevant. My new confidence didn't go unnoticed as colleagues started commenting on my positive changes. Female graduate students who'd previously seen me as just another married professor began engaging me in longer conversations, and I found myself remembering what it felt like to be valued for my intelligence and expertise. Chelsea remained completely oblivious to this transformation, too focused on her own social media presence and work drama to notice that her husband was becoming someone who no longer needed her validation to feel worthwhile. She continued her pattern of casual disrespect, assuming my devotion was unconditional regardless of her treatment, not realizing that I was systematically preparing to show her exactly what happens when someone discovers their actual worth. Chelsea's best friend Sophia surprised me with an unscheduled visit on a Thursday evening when Chelsea was working late, nervously shifting from foot to foot on our front porch as if debating whether to flee before I answered the door. I'd known Sophia for almost as long as I'd known Chelsea, watching her navigate her own marriage struggles over the years, but she'd never sought me out for a private conversation until this moment that would change everything between us. She looked genuinely distressed as she explained that she couldn't stop thinking about the birthday party conversation, how mortified she'd felt listening to Chelsea mock our intimate life while I was literally just outside the door preparing dinner for everyone. She confessed that she'd tried to change the subject multiple times that night, but Chelsea had been relentless in her cruel comedy routine, apparently energized by her audience's laughter rather than concerned about the possibility that I might overhear her systematic humiliation of our marriage. Sophia revealed that she'd been divorced for 2 years after taking her own husband Michael for granted, recognizing the same destructive patterns in Chelsea's behavior that had destroyed her own relationship when she realized too late what she'd lost. She admitted that she'd watched me become increasingly withdrawn over the past year, noting how I'd stopped contributing to conversations at group gatherings and how I seemed to apologize for everything I said as if my mere presence was somehow burdensome to others. I invited her inside for coffee, genuinely curious about her perspective as someone who'd witnessed our relationship dynamics from the outside, and found myself relaxing for the first time in months as she spoke about me with genuine respect and admiration. She told me that she'd always found me attractive and thoughtful, questioning how Chelsea could be so blind to qualities that any reasonable woman would treasure, describing my intelligence and kindness as rare commodities that her friend treated like embarrassing flaws. Our conversation became increasingly intimate as she shared details about her own failed marriage, how she'd criticized Michael's hobbies and mocked his career choices until he'd simply stopped trying to connect with her, and how she'd realized after he left that she'd been the problem all along. Sophia made it clear that she would never waste someone like me, that watching Chelsea treat me with such casual cruelty had made her appreciate what true partnership should look like, and that any woman with sense would feel grateful to be loved by someone who actually paid attention to what mattered to her. I found myself studying her face as she spoke, noting the genuine warmth in her eyes when she looked at me, the way she leaned forward when I shared stories about my research, and how naturally our conversation flowed without the constant undercurrent of criticism I'd grown accustomed to at home. When she suggested we continue our discussion over coffee sometime when Chelsea wouldn't be suspicious, I agreed immediately, understanding that this woman saw value in everything about me that my wife had trained me to hide or apologize for possessing. Nathan and Sophia began meeting regularly under the guise of discussing Chelsea's behavior, but their connection deepened as she treated him with the respect and admiration he'd been missing at home for 7 years. I found myself looking forward to our coffee meetings with an anticipation I hadn't felt since my early dating days, discovering what it meant to have someone genuinely interested in my thoughts, my work, and my observations about the world around us. Sophia asked detailed questions about my coral restoration research, requesting explanations of complex scientific processes with the kind of intellectual curiosity that made me remember why I'd fallen in love with marine biology in the first place. She listened when I described the intricate relationships within reef ecosystems, making insightful connections between my work and environmental issues she'd read about, treating my expertise as something valuable rather than a boring obsession that cleared rooms at dinner parties. During our third meeting at a quiet cafe near the university, she confessed that she'd been attracted to me for years but had respected my marriage until witnessing Chelsea's cruelty firsthand at the birthday party. She described watching me over the years at group gatherings, noting how I'd light up when discussing something I was passionate about, only to dim when Chelsea would interrupt with eye rolls or subject changes that made it clear my interests were unwelcome in social settings. Sophia told me that she'd often wondered what it would be like to be with someone who approached life with my combination of intelligence and genuine kindness, someone who remembered details about other people's lives and cared enough to follow up on things that mattered to them. I found myself sharing stories about my marriage that I'd never told anyone, describing the gradual erosion of my confidence as Chelsea's mockery became a constant background noise in our relationship. Sophia responded with anger on my behalf, expressing genuine outrage that anyone could treat their partner with such systematic disrespect, and I realized how starved I'd been for someone to validate my experience rather than telling me I was being too sensitive. During a particularly intense dinner conversation at a restaurant across town where we wouldn't risk being seen by mutual friends, Sophia made her intentions crystal clear by reaching across the table to take my hand while explaining that life was too short to waste on people who couldn't appreciate what they had. She told me that watching Chelsea throw away someone like me had made her realize exactly what she wanted in a partner, someone who showed love through attention to detail rather than grand gestures, someone who valued intelligence and conversation over social status and material possessions. The physical tension between us had been building for weeks, But when she leaned across the table and kissed me softly in the restaurant's dim lighting, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the intoxicating validation of being genuinely desired by someone who knew exactly who I was. I found myself torn between my growing feelings for someone who truly appreciated me and the knowledge that pursuing this connection would destroy multiple relationships. Yet the contrast between Sophia's warmth and Chelsea's cold mockery made the choice feel inevitable rather than calculated. When we moved to the restaurant parking lot and she kissed me again with unmistakable passion, I realized that I was about to cross a line that would change everything, but for the first time in years, I felt like someone worth fighting for. At Chelsea's company holiday party, I arrived with newfound confidence and immediately gravitating towards Sophia, who'd been invited as Chelsea's +1 since her divorce, creating the perfect storm that would expose everything in the most devastating way possible. I watched Chelsea work the room in her element, charming clients and colleagues with the vivacious personality that had initially attracted me but had disappeared from our private interactions years ago. She was too busy networking and posting social media content to notice how naturally Sophia and I fell into conversation by the bar, our obvious chemistry drawing curious glances from her coworkers who'd heard endless complaints about her boring husband but were now seeing someone entirely different. Sophia looked stunning in a black cocktail dress that hugged her curves perfectly, but more importantly, she looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room, asking about my latest research findings and laughing genuinely at my observations about the corporate crowd around us. I felt like the man I used to be before marriage convinced me that my thoughts and opinions were burdensome, engaging in witty conversations with Sophia while Chelsea's colleagues began whispering about the marine biologist's sudden transformation and obvious connection with his wife's attractive best friend. The irony wasn't lost on me that these same people had probably heard Chelsea's stories about her pathetic husband, yet here they were watching that same man command attention and respect from someone they clearly envied. During dinner, I found myself seated next to Sophia while Chelsea held court at the opposite end of our table, regaling her boss and senior colleagues with animated stories that probably included unflattering details about our home life. Sophia and I shared inside jokes and meaningful glances, our conversation flowing effortlessly while I noticed several of Chelsea's female coworkers studying our interaction with obvious interest and speculation. The transformation in my demeanor was impossible to ignore as I engaged confidently with other guests, my newfound self-assurance making me appear more attractive and socially capable than anyone at that table had probably expected based on Chelsea's descriptions. When Chelsea finally noticed our intimate dynamic during the dessert course, her face shifted from confusion to alarm as she watched her supposedly inadequate husband captivating her best friend with the charm and intelligence she'd spent years training him to suppress. She excused herself from her conversation and approached our end of the table with forced casualness, inserting herself between Sophia and me with the territorial instinct of someone who suddenly realized what she might be losing. Her attempt at damage control came too late because the entire table had already witnessed our connection, and when she made a snide comment about me finally learning to socialize properly, Sophia calmly dropped the bombshell that would destroy her world. She looked directly at Chelsea and said that it was funny how she complained about me being terrible in bed when I'd been absolutely amazing with her last weekend. The room fell into complete silence as 20 pairs of eyes focused on our table, watching Chelsea's face drain of color while processing that her private mockery had become public knowledge and her best friend had just revealed their affair to her entire professional network. I sat there calmly as Chelsea's world imploded around her, understanding that this moment of devastating public humiliation was exactly what she'd earned through years of treating our marriage like entertainment for her social circle. In the aftermath of Sophia's revelation, Chelsea broke down completely as the full scope of her situation became crystal clear. She'd lost her husband to her best friend through her own cruelty and disrespect, and now her entire professional network knew exactly what kind of person she really was behind closed doors. The car ride home was silent except for her muffled sobs, and I found myself feeling nothing but cold satisfaction as she finally experienced the public humiliation she'd been inflicting on me privately for 7 years. She tried to speak several times during that 20-minute drive, opening her mouth to offer explanations or apologies, but apparently realized that nothing she could say would undo what had just happened in front of her boss, her colleagues, and her clients. When we reached our house, she followed me inside like a lost child, watching helplessly as I calmly began pulling suitcases from the closet and methodically packing my belongings with the same precision I'd used to document her disrespect over the past months. Chelsea's desperate pleas for counseling and forgiveness fell on deaf ears as I explained that hearing every word from her birthday party had shown me exactly what our marriage meant to her, and that Sophia had simply demonstrated what genuine appreciation felt like after years of systematic mockery. I told her that 7 years of taking me for granted couldn't be fixed with tearful apologies or promises to change, that respect wasn't something you could rebuild once it had been destroyed through deliberate and repeated cruelty. She begged me to consider couples therapy, claiming that she'd been going through a difficult time at work and had taken her frustrations out on me unfairly, but I pointed out that her mockery of our intimate life had been performed for entertainment purposes rather than emotional release. The woman who'd spent years making me feel like my very existence was burdensome was now desperate for me to stay, suddenly recognizing my value only after watching someone else treasure what she'd discarded. As I packed my research materials and personal belongings, I calmly explained that she'd created this situation by treating our marriage like comedy material for her social circle, systematically destroying my confidence while assuming my devotion was unconditional regardless of her treatment. I told her that the most devastating part wasn't even the affair, but realizing that she'd never actually loved or respected the person I was, only the financial security and domestic convenience I'd provided while she searched for something more exciting. Chelsea's hysteria escalated as the reality of her losses became undeniable. Her husband, her best friend, her professional reputation, and her carefully constructed image had all crumbled in a single evening because she'd underestimated the consequences of chronic disrespect. She alternated between rage and desperation, accusing me of being vindictive and cruel, then immediately switching to promises that she'd become the wife I deserved if I'd just give her another chance to prove herself. I remained calm throughout her emotional breakdown, pointing out that someone who truly loved their partner wouldn't need a public humiliation to inspire basic respect and appreciation. When I loaded my truck with the last of my belongings, Chelsea stood in the driveway still wearing her cocktail dress from the party, mascara streaking down her face as she realized that her years of taking me for granted had finally caught up with her in the most devastating way imaginable. I told her that she'd taught me exactly what I was worth by showing me how little she valued me, and now she could experience what real consequences felt like when someone found their worth elsewhere and refused to accept anything less than genuine appreciation.